Okay, we probably have some more people coming in, but I'm going to go ahead and start welcoming all of you, our audience and panelists, to our online panel today under the rubric of the Dean's Lecture and Concert Series here in Santa Fe, operating in a different format and platform than we usually do, and we're happy to be here. Our title today is Journalism, Democratic Citizenship, and the Public Interest. And as all of you who saw our advertisement, our flyer, know, we have three distinguished alumni journalists who I'm also happy to call friends joining us today. And we have three of our seniors from the class of 20, of course, joining me as co-moderators for the conversation. And for those of you in the audience, our vision is that we're going to have a moderated discussion for 45 minutes to an hour. Then we'll sort of take a breath and pivot, and then take some questions from the audience that can be typed in the Q&A function, and our moderators will select some of those questions. And we anticipate wrapping up entirely at about 4:30. So again, welcome to all of you that are joining us. This includes students, faculty, staff, alumni, board members, all members of our college community. Some are finding their way to this from both campuses. We're happy to have all of you and other friends and visitors, some prospective students and families. We welcome all of you. By way of welcome, I just want to take a moment to, as I am in every setting in which I'm addressing folks, to commend the efforts of both of our campus communities and really our whole college community as we, like everyone else, have dealt with the extraordinary disruption of the last few weeks and have pivoted into completing the academic year remotely and online. And I'm not going to enumerate any of them here, but truly heroic efforts have been made by our students, staff, faculty, alumni, friends, board members to put us in a position to complete the academic year with vigor and the spirit of the St. John's community that I'm so proud of in so many ways has shown itself resilient and ready for this kind of challenge and ready to adapt. Our three seniors here are examples of students who are now completing the year online, completing their senior orals and all other requirements. And it's really extraordinary, the goodwill, the generosity, the hard work under what we all understand to be extraordinarily challenging times from an academic standpoint, but obviously the broader human drama in which we find ourselves is a challenge for all of us. So I want to thank and commend our community in this setting, and thank you three seniors for your willingness to make extra time for this opportunity, and the same for you three alumni that are joining us today. This panel was originally conceived to be part of a large conference we were going to have this spring, and Jane and Danny and Elizabeth were going to be here joining us next weekend. That conference was under the theme Democracy, Liberal Education, and the Common Good. And it was something that we had conceived over the course of a couple of years as appropriate for a presidential election year. What we thought would be a moment where a community like ours, thinking deeply about what we do at St. John's in the context of liberal education, great books, reflection on politics, ethics, morality, both past and present, it would be a moment to try to have that open up in a fruitful way when we imagined that there would be a rather feverish political and media environment around us. And we thought we'd address a range of themes in that conference, but journalism and the role of journalism in this context seemed paramount to us. We had no idea what circumstances we'd actually find ourselves in, and I'm sure that we will spend some time talking about the added disruption that coronavirus and COVID-19 have brought to us, and how that's impacting your work and somehow crossing with those other themes and vectors that we would have been talking about anyway, and that we will talk about today. But that conference, of course, had to be canceled. And I'm so grateful that that Jane and Danny and Elizabeth were willing to just kind of take a flyer and jump into this platform and allow us to do this piece of the conversation, the larger conversation that we hope to have. And of course, we hope to bring you to our campus in the future to continue the discussion. Okay, actually with that, I really want to allow all of you to introduce yourselves. I'll just say that we have 3 exceptional seniors here, and I'm glad to know them well, and they're leaders both academically and as citizens of our community. And I'll ask them one by one to introduce themselves and maybe say something about their senior essay topic and postgraduate plans briefly. And then we'll go right into introductions from our 3 panelists. We had brief bios that went out with our flyer. I would just say, I'm not going to add at length, they can tell a little bit of their story, and I'd ask each of them in telling their story to also make a connection to how their education at St. John's has somehow been a seed or a frame or a horizon within which their work as journalists has proceeded. But I won't elaborate on their bios except to say that I've followed Jane and Danny's work for many years, especially Jane's voice as a commentator on ESPN on some very important issues that I might say transcend sports or somehow modify what one thinks of as sports journalism. For example, her reporting and commentary on the NFL's handling of domestic abuse when that emerged as a major theme for sports and for the nation. Danny's work as an investigative journalist and his journalism broadly at the New York Times. If you're a regular reader of the Times as I am, you can't help but come across his articles regularly. He's been involved with a team that won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of the Spitzer scandal, as I recall, and more recently has really done some very high-profile work on the controversies and the internal workings of the NRA over the last couple of years. And I heard him interviewed on Fresh Air with Terry Gross not too long ago, and I thought it was really impressive and important work. And Elizabeth, who is a more recent graduate of the college, but has already had a distinguished career in environmental reporting for Alaska Public Radio and now the Anchorage Daily News as an editor. And her work really emerged for me in hearing a national broadcast of coverage of the ever-evolving and controversial decisions being made around drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and related issues. So you can dig into their bios more. They can say a little bit about their work, but really alumni that we can be proud of and that I think are doing very important work, such important work in the sphere of journalism. And with that, I will take a breath and ask our seniors to introduce themselves.
I'll begin. My name is Nani Detti. I'm a senior. I'm from Ethiopia originally. I wrote my senior essay on Nikolai Gogol's The Overcoat. I focused on brotherhood and what that means. Currently, my postgraduate plans are focusing on my project in Ethiopia called Misale Initiative, which essentially is currently focusing on working with the government and different organizations in creating awareness about coronavirus and making sure that vulnerable communities have the resources they need during the shutdown. And afterwards, I plan on going to graduate school for international politics.
Hi, I'm Abdullah Mirza. I'm a senior from South Bend, Indiana. And I wrote my senior essay on Aristotle's Art of Rhetoric, trying to understand the philosophical and psychological reasons why we are persuaded of what we are persuaded by. And next year I plan to do some comparative history studies in a master's program.
My name is Moreno. I'm a senior originally from Stockton, California. Both myself and Mr. Mirza have been working with The Moon, which is the Santa Fe student newspaper for the last couple of years. I did my senior paper on Montaigne's essay of experience, focusing on the embodiment of language. And I will be attending Georgetown University in the fall in the linguistics department for a master's program.
And now perhaps we can go right into introductions from our panelists. Danny, will you begin?
Sure. And thank you, Walter, for inviting us. Appreciate it. I've been at the Times for 20 years. And every time I do an appearance like this, I have to tell my editor what I'm doing. But, in this case, my editor is also a Johnny. So it was not hard to get approval for this gig. St. John's, had a huge impact, not so much on my desire to do journalism, but just in, I think, my ability to do journalism. Before I came to St. John's, I really wasn't that interested in learning that much. But really from the get-go at St. John's, it kind of woke me up in a way to sort of thinking and learning. And those are skills that I've really used throughout my career. A Johnny helped me get a job after school at the Washington Post as a clerk. It was a difficult job to get, even so. I had to do 4 interviews over 6 months just to get a job as a clerk. But my intent really wasn't to go into journalism. It was to be an artist. And I enrolled in art school while I was working at the Post as a clerk. But once I started art school, I kind of realized I had the bug for journalism, and I dropped out of art school, and I kept writing stories. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm glad to be here.
Elizabeth, let me hear from you.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Harball. I graduated in 2009, and if it makes people feel better, I didn't graduate knowing I wanted to be a journalist. I didn't graduate knowing quite what I wanted to be at all. So I went to Japan and taught English for a year while I thought about it, and then I came back to Santa Fe and found an odd gig writing for Contemporary Arts Weekly, even though I knew nothing about contemporary art. I don't know where I got that kind of confidence, but there we go. And found myself at Columbia Journalism School, and I knew I loved writing. I always loved writing at St. John's. It was a great passion of mine. I think I had a moment when I was at Columbia where I was like, oh, I have to call and talk to people and ask some hard questions in addition to writing. So that part of journalism was an adjustment for me, but I've really grown to love it, and how it's made me, I think, a better person. And part of what I think St. John's gave me was sort of an appropriate balance of intellectual courage and humility, which you really need in journalism. You need to be able to sort of bravely wade into topics that you're not an expert on, and just go for it. For instance, in my first job or internship, I was having to write stories about climate models, and I didn't know anything about climate models, but St. John's sort of gave me the platform to be like, all right, I'm just going to dive in. I'm going to read these studies. I'm going to talk to these scientists. And also it made me, St. John's helped prepare me for sort of what my intellectual limits are. Not in a bad way, but just to understand what you don't know, which is incredibly important. And so that sort of balance, which I really cultivated at St. John's, has helped me throughout my career. I'm now at the Anchorage Daily News, which is a local newspaper here in Alaska, and I'm happy to evangelize as long as people are willing to listen on the importance of local news, especially in this moment. It's a difficult moment for everyone. It's a difficult moment for local news, but it's also truly an amazing moment and a privilege to be doing what we're doing nowadays.
Thank you.
Hi, I think I'm probably last up, so I'll just start. I'm Jane McManus, and right now I wear two hats. I'm a columnist, sports columnist for the New York Daily News, and I'm also the director of Marist Center for Sports Communication, which is basically their sports journalism, PR, and broadcasting program. Sometimes people confuse me with the athletic director, which I am not. So I came into St. John's having been the editor of my junior high paper, and I thought I wanted to be a journalist. And then St. John's kind of talked me out of that. And by the time I left, I wanted to be a lawyer. It's a long story, but I'm not a lawyer. So, but what St. John's gave me, in addition to the critical thinking skills, which I do think kind of transcend what you do, and it's more about how you do what you do. And that's something that Johnny's kind of taken to the world with them wherever they go and whatever they end up doing. But I got super into playing basketball at St. John's. So like for me, it really awakened me to the idea of being an athlete, the idea of kind of what the physicality is for us. In addition to kind of being intellectual creatures. And I really loved how those kinds of things went hand in hand. And, I used to take down Walter quite a bit. I know I humiliated him on the court a number of times. Actually, we played for the same team. But anyway, so like that kind of was something that I found interesting. And then I went and I actually worked for a law firm and realized I wanted nothing to do with law at all. People who worked in it, I found were miserable. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking you wanted to go into law. It really helps to work in a law firm before you go to law school. But then I ended up going to Columbia Graduate School of Journalism as well, and I graduated in '97. And I ended up kind of teaching there as well after I graduated. So after being out and reporting and doing a lot of sports writing and covering a lot of events, I went back and I adjuncted for the class that I actually took. And then that kind of positioned me over the course of the years. I did it out of loyalty for a professor, which maybe some of you all can understand. But I think, it kind of positioned me that the intellectualism and then the continued pursuit of that, and then taking that into sports, which I think some people kind of get distracted and they think they're part of a team, or they really kind of want to be part of the action as opposed to kind of being detached. And I think kind of St. John's prepared me for that idea of being detached and in the observation and the process of observation. But it ended up preparing me for the job that I have now, which is kind of an academic / journalism job. And what I like about it is I get to kind of think about issues in journalism and sports journalism in particular, which is at a real crossroads right now. And again, I just don't think I necessarily would have gotten the preparation to do this if I'd gotten a communications degree.
Thank you all so much. We'll have a rematch when you're out here. Doesn't look quite like it used to when I'm out on the court, at least. So I'm going to get us started with a question, and I'll ask you to speak to it first, Elizabeth, and then the other panelists can weigh in. In a way, it's so broad that it will undergird other things we'll come back to, so you can kind of take it in whatever direction you'd like initially. But going back really a year and a half when we started conceiving of the conference we envisioned, at that time, at the end of 2018, Time magazine had as its person of the year journalists under the title The Guardians. And the full title, I believe, was The Guardians and the War on Truth. But they had 4 covers. 3 were referencing international contexts of death or persecution, imprisonment of journalists, and the cover that referred to the American situation tragically had to do with our Annapolis Capitol and the loss of life at that newspaper. Overall, what Time seemed to be trying to capture in that issue was a sense of dramatic change in the world of journalism, a time where it's needed more than ever for democratic life here in the United States, but also in fragile democracies abroad, and that various forces and changes seem to be putting perhaps unprecedented pressure on journalism. So one way I've thought about it is you could say it's a kind of golden age for the importance of journalism nationally and internationally, and also a kind of twilight, perhaps, of some traditional forms or stability in that world. And so a time of opportunity and importance kind of being, I don't know, tectonic pressure between that and various forces. And what time evoked was suppression of journalists by authoritarian regimes and kind of new techniques for that, you might say, the technological disruption, and in the case of the United States, a kind of unprecedented relationship between a president and his administration and the press. And that made that a moment where they wanted to elevate journalists as Person of the Year. And that issue was the first thing I put in my folder for this conference that we envisioned a year and a half ago, and it's sort of stayed with me since then. So I guess I just asked how you live that, or how you think about it, or one of the ways in which you think about this as a time of, if you accept that, as a time of maybe growing importance and also growing challenge or disruption or change. And as I say, why don't we start with you, Elizabeth, and if others want to follow up on this point now, you can, or we can come back to it in some more particular ways.
Yeah, I mean, that is sort of the question that, working at a local newspaper, that's what keeps us up at night every single day. I mean, you are seeing local newspapers really struggle financially all around the country right now, especially so now. And at the Anchorage Daily News, we saw our ad revenue go into the toilet when this happened. At the same time, and I think a lot of local newspapers have stopped thinking of themselves as newspapers, like a piece of paper, like we're transitioning to, sort of a digital audience, digital subscriptions, et cetera. There's a lot, I mean, that's sort of the conversation that's happening right now. And when I went to journalism school back in 2012, it was kind of this, I have never known a journalism world that has felt financially stable as long as I've been in it. When I was in journalism school, it was kind of this, oh crap, everything's bad, good luck. That was sort of the tone. And I have sort of landed on my feet and been employed constantly, but I've known many people over the years who get laid off, et cetera. So that's scary. And that's real. But at the same time, it's also incredibly exciting because, I'm excited to be where I am because it's very innovative, and we are constantly thinking about why we're there and why readers need us, and why we are here for our community. And this particular moment with the coronavirus pandemic has brought that into incredibly sharp relief, like why we are here. We're here for so many reasons, for raw information. People come to us as a source for that. They come to us for analysis. They come to us as a mirror to the community to show them, what we're mourning, how we're coping with this. And we have seen our readership go through the roof over the past couple of weeks. We have seen digital subscriptions. I think we had a 10% increase in digital subscriptions since this started. And that's some business talk, but it's very real for us. And then we also started a fund when things kind of went financially south a couple of weeks ago, saying, if you'd like to donate to us, go for it. And it has been so amazing and heartening to see our community kind of come together and show how much they value us as a local source for information. So that's been amazing. And it's been really amazing to be part of this huge, important story, and every day feel like we are giving people what they need in a very basic way. And we're constantly listening to our community and what they need, and trying to figure out how we can best serve them. And I think last year, day-to-day journalism, you tend to forget that, but this whole situation we're in is an amazing reminder of that. And I'm working all the time. I hardly get any sleep, but I'm so happy to be doing what I'm doing. Jane
or Danny, do either of you all want to speak to
I mean, I would say the challenges are global, right? I mean, if you look at the last few years, we've had a rise of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes across the world, and sort of a, you know, some people call it a retreat from democracy. So it's not, I don't think it's a surprise that democracy and journalism are in trouble at the same time, right? And you know, you can look at you know, you can look at a place like Hungary, which is an EU member state, where they're, you know, Viktor Orban, who runs Hungary, has been consolidating power, and his allies have been buying up the media for some time. And during this pandemic, they just passed a new law where they can jail a journalist for up to 5 years for spreading misinformation. They put a similar kind of law in place in the Philippines. You know, so we see these kind of things happening, and Brazil is a similar, you know, similar country where you see the leader of Brazil using the term fake news. I mean, that, you know, a lot of these sort of strongman type leaders across the world are using that term and are cracking down the media. So that's a challenge for the press across the world.
In some way, I think we're in a better place in our country just because, you know, we're the fourth estate, right? We're written into the Constitution, and we're taken as a necessary part of a functioning democracy. So at least we have that going for us. That doesn't mean necessarily, though, that that we are immune from those very real pressures. And I kind of felt like, you know, it was interesting when Trump was elected and showed some of those tendencies. Certainly was, you know, very anti-press from the very beginning. You know, in some ways, it kind of felt familiar to me, because oftentimes covering a team can be like covering, you know, a hostile entity. Really, they're not all that interested in having you there. They don't want you to report what's happening from the inside. And, you know, and they try to, you know, either use strong arm tactics and deny access. And there are all of these different things that actually happen behind the scenes, you know, not just in sports, but you know, across the board. But, you know, for me, people who do, I mean, you could probably tell from hearing Elizabeth and Danny that people who do this job do it for more than just a paycheck. We really believe in the principles behind it. And a lot of times journalists who are laid off and don't have a prospect of getting a job will fight to tell stories anyway, in whatever form that they can. And it's because, you know, I think we recognize how important it is to, you know, shine light in places and tell stories that won't be told otherwise. In some ways, you know, I graduated from J school in =97, and the industry was still in pretty decent shape at that point. It hadn't really been hit by what was going to happen financially because of the internet. But I get mad when I think about how poorly the business side of journalism dealt with this. You could see it coming. It was a slow motion change, and they did not they didn't do enough to keep journalism from being propped up by this advertising model that was disappearing. And I think, you know, we see now some movement, whether it's venture capitalism or venture capital or the nonprofit, you know, that Elizabeth was talking about, and trying to find other ways to fund journalism. But we are going to have to find other ways to fund journalism. And that's just a fact of the matter. So dealing with those two competing issues is, you know, leaves journalists, you know, oftentimes not being able to make a living right now, especially if you're not working. You know, we all know people working at CNN or the big, you know, so you think people are making a lot of money in the media business, but the nuts and bolts people in this business are working for local papers, and, you know, and they're finding that their paychecks are getting slashed. It's, you know, it's a tough time right now, but I think journalism is obviously more important than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just to follow up on that, I think what's happening in local news, you know, and Elizabeth touched on this, to me, it's a crisis. I mean, it's just, you can't have a functioning democracy if you don't, you know, have aggressive local news. And, you know, I was a State House reporter for a long time, and you're just seeing State House, you know, press, you know, the press in the State House is just shrinking, and there's so few reporters left. in state capitals. And if you're not, if you're not doing investigative work at the state and local level, what's really happening with these governments at those levels, you don't really know.
So we'll range around some, and probably everything will intersect with some of the comments you just made. I turn to our seniors now to advance some questions.
I can begin. I guess the first question I'll direct to is to Jane. And one thing I'm interested in is hearing more about your work on the intersection between journalism and social issues like the Me Too movement or, domestic abuse allegations in the NFL. These are clearly very difficult topics. And I know that for me at St. John's, we do deal with a lot of difficult topics, and how do you engage with that? And I want to learn more on how that has prepared you, or how you deal with in your work on these difficult, reporting difficult topics.
Right. Well, in journalism, one of the things that they say, and thank you for that question. And I'm also impressed by what you're doing. So I just want to lay that out there as well. But I think, there's this idea that you want to zag when everybody else is zigging, kind of, and not necessarily. There's a bit of a groupthink that can come into, a press box. And I think the difficulty of being a woman in sports ended up being a strength in that situation, because I was certainly aware of what domestic violence was or what abuse is. And I was not afraid to look at it, and I was not afraid to acknowledge that it was happening. And I think, there are a lot of people in sports who kind of, and not everyone, and certainly I think it's changed since 2014, which is when that started happening. But there are a lot of people who kind of want to be, part of the fun story, and especially at ESPN. Sometimes, we were encouraged to talk about what our college team had been and to wear a team jersey. And I was always kind of like, well, first of all, my school didn't have sports except for the ones I played. And, second of all, it's just like, that's not, I can't imagine that Danny would be wearing like a go state capitol, congressman t-shirt, like when he's covering the thing. It's kind of strange to think about, and it's antithetical to the idea of having any objectivity. But to me, it was super important also to not, because I think a lot of people looked at women, like a woman covering this issue in sports, as though I were an advocate. They mistook the journalism that I was doing for advocacy. And so because of that, I felt it was really important to make sure that I was talking to people on all sides of the equation. I was talking to people in law enforcement. I was talking to advocates. I was talking to the people who were representing as clients, people who'd been accused. I was looking into the idea of false allegations and what that meant. I felt it was really important to get everything that I could, all the information that I could, so that when I did present information, that it was, that people could see that I'd actually done my homework, and that I wasn't just saying I disagreed with something or being outraged by something. And I feel like that's, I feel like there's a level of professionalism that you have to have. And that was a really big part of what my thinking was behind that. But I do think that it had to do, particularly with the idea of being okay with feeling like an outsider in something, and not feeling like you have to be part of a group think on it. And I do think that comes from that, again, the critical thinking that comes from being at St. John's and looking at things and taking a position that you are willing to defend that is different from what other people are saying, which you have to do in a seminar setting all the time. And being able to use your voice and defend what you think, and actually, but make sure you're thinking it through also.
So perhaps related to that, I have a question about writing, which I think I'd like to direct to Danny at first, but either of you can feel free to chime in on this, your thoughts on this. So, the freshmen and the juniors, they're writing their seminar papers right now. I know there's a couple of them in the audience, but I was curious about your process of, how do you choose a topic given all the leads and all the stories you get in the first place? How do you choose what to write on? But then, yeah, so like what informs that, or what should inform that? Because that seems like a very powerful position that, especially an investigative reporter, is in. But then also, how do you go about concluding? How do you arrive at a conclusion? And because it's more than just facts, right? There's just the facts, but then there's a sort of truth behind it, which we sort of get when we read the historians. And there's a way in which the work of a journalist seemed also like a historian, in that, when we look back on, it's something that we look back on as a sort of chronicle, but the historians we read, right, it's more than just the facts, and they sort of put their own spin on it. So I guess, yeah, what is your writing process? But then also, how do you judge the success of that project, and what does truthful account look like to you?
Well, I think the first thing you had asked about is how do I pick what I write about, and that's an important part of what I do, is just figuring out what to write about as an investigative reporter, because most of the stories I do are self-generated. So I spend a lot of time reading, just reading a lot of different things, and I write about what interests me, and I focus on areas where I think I actually have something to say, or have a chance to add something of interest that people don't know. So with the National Rifle Association was one recent topic I took on, and towards the end of 2018, I went to my editors, and I said, the way the NRA gets written about a lot of the time is there's a mass shooting, and we write about the NRA during that mass shooting. And so the media will go from mass shooting to mass shooting, and that's the only time they'll call the NRA. So my thought was, maybe we should, I'd like to actually try to engage with this organization, find out more about them, go a bit deeper, and really talk to them, really have a dialogue. Again, that does get back to the Johnny way, I guess. You try to have a dialogue with people, you try to understand with people, whether you agree or disagree or whatever. It's good to, it's good to be able to understand people and where they're coming from. So, I wrote a lot of tough stories on the NRA and their financial, some of their financial mismanagement. The investigation started while I was, sort of in the middle of the stories I was writing, but still I continued to be able to talk to the organization throughout that. And I ended up interviewing Wayne LaPierre, who's the head of the organization, who hasn't really had an in-depth interview in a long time. So, I think that's important to me, to try to hear any organization out, and also just try to find out as much as I can about them, and to tell readers things they don't know, give them a deeper insight that they wouldn't otherwise have.
I'd love to build a bit on what Abdullah asked for Danny, but I'd love to open this up for Jane and Elizabeth as well. One of the things that I have found over the last 10 years is that there's a lot of questions as to whether or not journalism is speaking about truth or opinion. And that seems to be based on what someone might think of as factual or unfactual before they even start reading a piece. There's also this, it seems like there's this big erosion of civility in the way that we interact with questions that are controversial. So I'm wondering, how does that inform your journalism? Does it affect the way you write? Does it affect the process, or do you find yourself moving forward? Like I said, this is a question for everyone, but I'd like to start with Danny.
Well, my personal style, I think, is to try to be as objective as I can. I mean, I think this has become a big issue with Twitter, with social media. I think, a lot of journalists are more subjective, I'd say, than maybe they were 10, 15 years ago. Just because, and I think a big part of that is the influence of social media. I guess I try not to be. I try to be as objective as I can. I mean, no one can ever be fully, we're not robots. But I guess that's the way I approach it. But it's definitely it's a changing landscape for media. We all have to interact with social media. So you do always wonder, am I editorializing, in this tweet, in this Facebook post? And these are questions that, early in my career, I never really had to grapple with.
If I could step in, I covered climate change for quite some time, which is a really interesting space for that and very quickly evolving, and one in which the journalism community really has a very live internal debate on how you cover climate change. Obviously, climate change is real, but there's and for a while there, this was kind of before my time, there was a habit of trying to be objective, and you interview the climate change scientist and then you interview the denier, and sort of the industry had to realize, no, that's not how we operate. And yet, there's climate denial that persists. And now there's another sort of really interesting dialogue on objectivity, where you have a number of good journalism operations like The Guardian saying, we're going to call this the climate crisis. This is the new language that we need to use to refer to this, and that's the most accurate, which is fascinating and at the same time very frustrating dialogue. At the Anchorage Daily News, if we referred to it as a climate crisis in a red state, not to say that we shouldn't do it, but there would be a very different audience reaction than perhaps what The Guardian is getting. And is that objective to call climate change the climate crisis? I think it probably is, but there is a lot of pushback in the community on that. And lately in my community, I've been witnessing this sort of really interesting and scary parallel between my experience in covering climate change, and now I'm sure a lot of you noticed in the last week, there are these protests happening about the shutdowns, or as we call it in Alaska, the hunker downs. And we now in Alaska, we've got about 300 cases, and we now have a full-blown movement of COVID deniers happening. People saying this isn't real, this is not a crisis, we should go back to reality. And how you cover that, how you cover those voices, while at the same time making very clear, no, there's a very real disease happening, is something that we have to think a lot. And it's been scary and surreal for me to see the climate change coverage parallels fly up in my face with the COVID-19 crisis as well. And realizing that there is a group of folks out there where no matter what it is we say, and not to say we stop trying to reach those people, but we are going to be dismissed. And sometimes it feels to me, whether it's because of social media or other things, that vein is growing and becoming more powerful. And I think all we can do is keep doing our jobs the best we can and try to ameliorate it. But it has been quite striking in the past week just to see that happening.
That's interesting. I think there's been, when we went to J school, I don't know, probably 2012 as well, but when I was in J school, there was this idea that journalists had to be objective and that there were these standards of objectivity. And, those kind of had been codified long before women were in the business, long before people of color were in the business, when everyone could kind of feel like they weren't under threat because their status quo was going to remain the same no matter what happened. And so then when women come in the business, or when people of color come in the business and they say, well, no, I kind of am going to treat domestic violence like it's an actual thing that happens to people. And then you can be like, oh, well, we're going to, that's not objective. So to me, the idea of objectivity itself is a way of kind of shutting down avenues of reporting, honestly, and saying that they're illegitimate when just because, you know, of a different standard from a different time. So for me, I try to think of myself as being fair as opposed to being objective, and to kind of, you know, understand what my own things are that I presuppositions that I have about different things. And the example that I generally use for this is when I was a younger reporter. I was a vegetarian at the time, and I was assigned the opening day of turkey hunt season with a father and his 14-year-old son. And so I was kind of, you know, wrestling with how I was going to do this story. And I spent the day with them, and I, you know, really listened to them and got to know them. And I wrote this huge story, took up a full page in the paper. And the next day I got a call, and there was the father was at the desk, and he said, you know, I just have to tell you, I felt like you really got me and my son, and here's some venison salami. And he gave me this humongous hunk of venison salami. And so to me, like, that's a way of talking about how a reporter can tell a story, even though you might have, you know, you may live your life alone a certain way, or you may have political opinions or whatever, that you can still talk to people, and you can still get a sense of who they are, and you can still be fair to their experience, and you can still report out a story, keeping in mind what your blind spots are. And so to me, I kind of, and luckily I'm a columnist, right? So, you know, I'm able to legally have a point of view in journalism, and which is good, because I do have strong points of view, but I'd never let that get in the way of, or as a substitute for reporting a column. I feel like you have to report columns just as hard as you would report a story, because oftentimes your own, I can't tell you how many times I've started a column with, you know, outrage about something, and then I make a couple calls to people who wouldn't agree with me, and I am like, oh, I had that wrong. You know, I mean, you really do. You have to constantly challenge your own notions of things and yourself. And I feel like that idea of objectivity often meant that reporters didn't have to challenge their own, what they were tacitly supporting, and the storytelling that they were doing that was discounting certain people, or it was blind to power and how power influenced different situations. So, you know, sometimes reporting has ended up supporting a status quo when, you know, in reality, I think that's not objective.
Yeah, I mean, I think another important thing is you can't, and I think Elizabeth was getting at this maybe, but, you know, there's a something called both siderism, right? You can't just say, well, this side says this and the other side says that, and just sort of throw up your hands. I mean, I think you've got to do your own analysis and try to figure out, well, what is actually the truth here? What's, you know, what actually happened? You know, what does the data tell you? You can't just simply hear from both sides and walk away. I think there has to be some level of analysis beyond that. And, you know, I think your reporting tells you some things are true and some things aren't, and you need to report that.
And well, Danny, I mean, I think if you think of like Aristotle and rhetoric, right? There's a lot of rhetoric that's fairly empty being used these days. And I think of Kellyanne Conway talking about how the WHO fell down on COVID-19 because they had 18 other shots at it, right? Well, this is COVID-19, you know, completely substituting the idea of the 19th version of something for the disease that emerged in 2019. Right. And so if you were just as a journalist to say, well, Kellyanne Conway said, you know, this, then you are being played, and you don't, you know, so you have to be able to try to see through, you know, the sophistry that gets thrown your way, whether it's, you know, it happens in sports too, but certainly I think at the, you know, at the level of rhetoric that's presented now politically is so disingenuous that you really have to, really do have to.
Yeah, I mean, when something is clearly false, you need to say it's clearly false. I mean, I think that's a good rule.
Well, one question I had adding to that is with regards to the topic of misinformation and disinformation, and I think you guys have touched a little bit about it. And I know as journalists, your job is to uncover the truth and not be biased. And I think journalists are doing that. But what can governments or, even everyday people do to combat misinformation and disinformation? We see it now with the virus reporting and, some people claiming there's a cure for it and other things like that. And I want to hear a bit more about, from your view, what things should be done to combat that, not just, of course, with your work as journalists, but what can governments do? What can we as everyday people do to kind of identify those and combat?
I mean, I think that's a tricky question, right? Because, on the one hand, you think like, well, are we the police for every conspiracy theory that comes out? Are we supposed to be chasing, every crazy thing that's happening? Is that really how we want to be spending our time, rather than doing our own stories? But the problem is, some of these conspiracy theories become so large and pervasive
Right.
and dangerous that you can't ignore them. But that's a really complicated thing, figuring that out.
Yeah.
Especially when there's government actors involved, right? You've got the
Right.
Russians, are doing what they do. You get the, other governments doing these things. So it becomes a national security issue in a lot of cases. But it's, I think a lot of time now is spent chasing these things down.
Yeah.
It is,
For me, I think it's really important to talk to people. There's no substitute for just getting out and talking to people and trying to figure things out. Think about something like stimulus checks going out and people saying, or applying for those small business loans, and, having somebody at the White House level say, oh yeah, that plan's going great. And then, but when you actually call people, what is the experience of people actually trying to do something like that? So I think a lot of times that the idea of how do you combat something like disinformation is just try to find out what's happening, what's the lived experience of somebody who's in a certain situation, or in who is a subject to these policies and these programs. And a lot of times it's not necessarily at a governmental level that something gets broken. It's that you find it, it's boots on the ground. It's just talking to people and trying to find out things. And I think that's, you can never kind of discount the shoe leather function, even though now we're all stuck in our homes, of being a journalist.
So earlier, Jane, you mentioned something about like the groupthink that can happen in a box, and I guess that relates to a question I had about sort of partisanship in the media in general, which maybe that's more apparent on like the national level than on the local level. But public trust in the media is also very low. I think it was at an all-time low in the US a few years ago, 2016. So I wonder what your thoughts, any of your thoughts were about how to build trust with readers and viewers, and perhaps, and I wonder if Elizabeth, if you had any insights on that on the local level. Maybe it's easier on the local level than on the national level.
I wish it was easier. I think this is something, there's kind of a growing conversation on this. I think the media in general has done kind of a rotten job explaining how it goes about things, and we could do a lot better in explaining to people how we come to our stories and how what we do is different than an opinion blog post or something. I think a little bit more explaining of the process of how the sausage is made would be helpful for the general public, because my own parents, who I consider to be fairly intelligent people, often send me opinion articles or articles from sources I consider to be unreliable, and see them to be sort of the same as what we do. So I think there's kind of a growing movement in journalism to gain reader trust by explaining what it is we do and how we do it. One small example I saw was a crime reporter at a local newspaper wrote a column just saying, like, this is why I cover the crimes I cover, and this is how I go about that process, and this is why I use the term accused. This is you know, and just kind of click down the list, and readers are actually, we're finding, very hungry for that on the most basic level, and they want that. I think for a long time we sort of, it was a little bit of an ivory tower, you know, we go into our buildings and make our calls, and then poof, there's a news article, read it and believe it, and that's not the case. So that, I mean, that's just a sort of long-winded way of saying, I think we could do better. I think we could show the lengths we go to make sure we're getting it right, what we do to verify all of our facts, and I mean, how horrible we feel when we get a fact wrong. Like, every journalist has that moment where they get a single fact wrong, or they misspell a name or something, and they feel like shit for weeks. And I think people just don't know that. And so that is an effort that I think we should work harder at.
For me, it was always funny to think about, because in sports, like, nobody calls you and argues with a score that you reported. You know, it's like, it's a bit of a test case, because, you know, people are placing bets based on your reporting. Nobody, you know, but if I say somebody's got, you know, a sore knee and they didn't practice on Wednesday, nobody calls me up to argue with me or says it's fake news. It's, to me, sport, it's different, because people sure do trust what sports writers write. And we are using the same standards that everybody else in the rest of the media is using, you know, and we do the same job and we're trained in the same way. So to me, you know, I do think we do a very bad job of talking about ourselves as a business. We do a bad job of talking about how decimated we've been in the past, you know, 10 years when it comes to layoffs and things like that. I think of the stories that I've seen written about coal mining and the job loss there and the devastation in communities. And I certainly think job loss has decimated the journalism community just as much, but we don't write stories about ourselves. So we don't do a very good job of kind of talking about what's happened in the, and what we face. And again, I think what happens, you know, what Elizabeth, what you alluded to, is that the worst example of something that isn't journalism is then used as an example of how terrible journalism is. And that is completely unfair. And I think it's probably because people don't have a really good sense of, you know, what sincerely produced and reported journalism really is.
I mean, this is a time when we're sort of under attack, right? And again, it's sort of throughout the world. So, you know, I think if you see these polls or whatever, I mean, they're going to show that. But, you know, I think a lot of that is just a function that you have prominent politicians attacking the news media. I mean, I think, you know, part of what we need to do is just keep doing good work and tune some of that out. I think, you know, our subscriptions have been growing strongly. So I think you do good work. You try to be open about what you're doing and not worry so much about, you know, what the attacks that are coming in.
But if I could ask a quick follow-up to that, I mean, you mentioned the case of Hungary in particular, but like what about journalists who maybe can't keep going on as business as usual, who might be feared about being given a 5-year jail sentence or something? Are there cases in which the form of journalism might have to change in the same way that perhaps philosophers in history who sometimes served as like gadflies to the government had to use tact or change their, you know, do they need to change their voice or change their methods in places where it's dangerous?
I think they do, just to survive. I mean, but in 2013, I went to the Republic of Georgia and Azerbaijan as a State Department envoy to talk about women in sports and journalism. And one of the outings, it was kind of a whirlwind tour, 3 weeks, you know, all over both of those countries. And there was one day when I was in Baku, which is the capital of Azerbaijan, and I was at a TV station there and talking to some of the women in journalism. And one of them came to me and, you know, and said kind of quietly, said, what kind of advice would you have when you're not allowed to report things that are happening? And I tried very hard to be, I was like, oh, well, then, you know, but the answer is, I don't know. You know, and it's very hard. And you do, you know, like the blogger in Malta who was blown up in a car bomb last year, you really do risk your life in certain authoritarian regimes if you report the truth. And so I think there are kind of these underground networks that develop to get facts out and to get the journalism part out while you go about doing your best to shade what you're saying enough so that someone might be able to read between the lines, or to unofficially, you know, get them some things out or report anonymously. But the truth of the matter is that if you cannot openly report something because of fear for your life, then you're not able to practice journalism as it traditionally is.
It's even a challenge for, you know, mainstream organizations. I mean, our China is expelling all of our reporters, all of our US reporters. And we have a huge operation in China, not just reporters, but editors in Hong Kong. And we have reporters throughout China. So it's, you know, so I think mainstream organizations are faced with these questions. Well, you know, do we continue to be aggressive in places like China, or do we try to, you know, not be so aggressive so we can stay in the country? And that's a real question in China that different mainstream organizations have handled differently. You know, personally, I think you have to continue to be aggressive. You have to continue doing the reporting. There's no, you know, I don't see the point in sort of pulling your punches. And if you get thrown out, then you continue reporting from the surrounding countries. You do the best you can. But it's, you know, it's an ongoing problem, even, you know, even for the New York Times.
I'm taking a glance at the clock. I knew our time would just fly along here. I guess I would like to invite our audience to use the Q&A function to post questions, and we have more that we'd like to ask, and we will. But if some questions come in there, our moderators can take a look and try to pluck some out of there. I might just, while folks are getting some questions up, maybe ask Elizabeth, especially you've already spoken to this, but ask directly about the impact of the coronavirus and COVID-19 crisis and disruption. There's so many levels to it. I mean, you mentioned, Elizabeth, how it's driving. First of all, you're working very, very hard, but that it's driving more readership and viewership. And I'll say frankly that I've looked at our Santa Fe newspaper and our Albuquerque newspaper online more daily in the last few weeks than I ever do or ever have. Of course, probably consumption of news generally is through the roof in this period. And I guess I'd just love to hear how it's maybe both, again, this might be my theme of the day. I wasn't thinking of it this way, but maybe both a challenge and an opportunity. I'm trying to figure out myself as a citizen how it's changing my relationship to what would have already been an obsessive news cycle all the way through the presidential election in the fall. And somehow this is both completely overlapping with it and replacing it, changing how we're what we're focused on. At the same time, it seems very political. So I just invite any reflections about how it's impacting your work or what you see as the sort of long tail of this through this year and beyond. Maybe start with you, Elizabeth, and we'll hear from others.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it first started to hit us, it was sort of this intimidatingly huge story, and just a sort of very Alaska aside. we had our first coronavirus case while the Iditarod dog sled race was going on. So a fair portion of our staff was like in remote Alaska covering a dog sled race of all things. And so we had like 3 reporters. And we realized this just massive story was coming our way and had to kind of mobilize. And so we're now, most of us are working from home, and there's just more stories and more coverage to do than we can realistically handle, to be honest. Like there's just so much, but we make choices every day based on the question, like, who is this story for, and how could we help people? And that takes a lot of different forms. I mean, there's just the basic, here are the numbers of the cases, here are roughly where they are, here's what we know about how many ventilators are in the state, here's what the local and state government is telling us to do. Just like getting that out, like, now there's a recommendation that you have to wear face masks, people, here it is. But then also I feel like we really have a responsibility to reflect this current moment back to our community, whether it's people dealing with job losses, whether it's very central events that are being canceled that we are no longer able to have. And we become kind of a place for emotional processing. Like the paper is where everybody goes to see how everybody else is doing. And so that's become a very important role in addition to that vital information. And then it's also a place for dialogue and debate on where we go next. And the answer is nobody knows, but there needs to be a space for people to try to figure out how we chart a path forward. And so the local newspaper is where all those voices are kind of coming together and mixing, and we're trying to figure it out. So it's overwhelming, and we're doing our best, and the community seems to really be responding. And I'm so proud of all the reporters that I edit for how hard they're working and how committed they are to this story, despite pay cuts and reduced hours that we've been forced to have. It just really speaks to how this occupation is kind of more of a vocation than a way to get a paycheck.
We've got a couple of questions here talking about or asking about COVID-19. So I want to start with Elizabeth, and if Danny or Jane want to jump in, I'm going to combine these two a bit. I'm wondering, or they're wondering here, Stephen Ferdy, is there any the COVID-19 or climate deniers, any thoughts about what might actually get them to listen? And then Allison Chapman asks about the difficulty of reporting when there's so much uncertainty going on about the information that's where we don't even know if it's true or not. How do you balance the urgency of sharing important information against the need to be careful and accurate? How does your reporting change when you have to think and write in an emergency?
I think I missed the first part of your question, but because you cut out a little bit, was it that how do you get these denier sorts, whether they're COVID-19 or climate deniers, to listen? Was that it?
Yeah, how do you get them to listen, or how to persuade them, especially when we're dealing with a situation where information is incomplete and there's a concern about being careful and accurate?
It's an incredibly hard question. I would like to hear Jane and Danny's thoughts on that as well. I mean, I think a big part of it here is to, with climate change and with COVID-19, is this sort of old thing in journalism, like you show and you don't tell, where we try to reflect the real things that are happening in the world, rather than like, it's not solely like experts warn, blah, blah, blah. It's like, here's this human being down in Girdwood, down the street, who has had COVID-19, and here's a photograph of him, and here's this guy talking about his experience and how he felt horrendous for 2 weeks and had to sit in his, like, that helps, that sort of on the ground journalism. But at the same time, it's really hard. Like, I find it frustrating. It keeps me up at night that there is sort of this vein of people who increasingly have the ability like to be allergic to the truth and what they're seeing in front of their own eyes. And I don't have all the answers other than to just keep doing what we're doing honestly and factually and responsibly.
It's interesting to me because I feel like sports itself is a COVID-19 denier, or at least some sports fans and industries, right? Because you have the president of the United States spending days when he could be trying to align these supply chains for PPE and ventilators on the phone with different commissioners of different professional sports. It really does, it's the idea of bread and circus. Not so much the bread, but definitely the circus in this current iteration. And I can say these things because I'm a columnist. So, and anyway, but I think that in some ways presenting the truth of whether or not, 22 men on a field are going to be able to tackle each other in September really does come down to trying to figure out what the science is. And, one of the first stories that I did was, it was before Rudy Gobert was diagnosed with coronavirus and the NBA was still playing and NCAA tournament was coming up. And I called a physician and I said, if you had two people sitting next to each other in stands, what's the likelihood that they could pass this virus to each other? And he took me through it. If this is a respiratory virus, think, you have an arm rest that might be shared. You have somebody standing up and yelling, and then the droplets coming out of that person's mouth, and you have in front of that person 6 or 7 people. And, and I think when you actually kind of go through it like that, and you have a referee throwing a ball into play, and then you have somebody else catching it, and what if it goes into the stand? And you just started to see, oh, so that's a vector of transmission. And it's kind of telling a story from that very, from the minutia of what it takes to transmit a virus and what is happening, in sports, in your average game, and how that works. And sometimes you just have to try to do something like that to show somebody, like how transmissible is this? How likely would you be to get it? And then, and it was the kind of at that moment that I woke up to the idea that, we were pretending that this would be a completely okay thing to do, to get people from all around the country and have them convene on one arena so that they could watch a college basketball team play a game and then return to their home states and cities, and what that might mean. And sometimes I think that the process of showing people something is just that simple of walking them through it. I mean, and I do believe you have to respect your reader and not talk down to them or treat them like idiots, because I don't like feeling like that when I'm reading and consuming media. And sometimes, when I see Sanjay Gupta take me through how to wash my hands for the 50th time, I get very annoyed. So I feel like you have to kind of balance those two things, because you will turn people off if they think you think they're stupid. But at the same time, I think it's very much about, okay, like, how do I make this real to somebody? Well, maybe I could put them in a stadium where they usually sit next to somebody they don't know, and then maybe they could see it that way.
We have a question from James Ashley. He asks, was Rousseau proven right about technology? Is technology corrupting?
I pass.
I was nominating you, Danny.
What about just to generalize it a little bit? I mean, it's again been laced through the conversation, the enormous, not the first, of course, but the enormous technological disruption of the last 10 to 15 years, and how it's changed journalism, the economic model, the consumption of it, all of it. I mean, you're all working, effectively for organizations that have transitioned effectively, maybe late, as Jane indicated, but you're in it. It's not on the horizon. It's already happened, let's say, but it does seem to have changed so much. And do you experience it as empowering for you at this point, or is it static and headwind for the kind of work you'd like to do?
There's another question that perhaps builds on this as well, from Elspeth Springstead. If I could just read that one, where she asks, Danny has mentioned that democracy and journalism go hand in hand, but with the rise of social media, there seems to be a great deal of amateur journalism. And is there a concern that the written word has lost its power or become diluted with so many voices out there, or does each voice bring something important to the conversation? And I think also about how, with the younger generation, the new generation, we communicate with memes and images increasingly as well.
I mean, I think there's no doubt that, say the Times has lost a degree of influence that it once had, and the local paper has lost tremendous influence. I mean, local papers used to be the real, voice of their communities, and that's really under siege. And, any of the national newspapers, I think their sort of singular voices have been, somewhat diminished by this sort of, this fire hose of voices that are out there. And there's so many fake, I shouldn't say fake, but just, you have these websites that are created that are not even really journalism, but they appear to be journalism, but they're created by political operatives, or they're created in a foreign country, for God knows what. So yes, that there is a drowning out effect, and I think there's in terms of the corrupting of technology, and I think the biggest would be Facebook, right, and their policies, their willingness to allow misinformation to go through their network. I would say that's the probably the most disturbing question, I think, when it comes to information flow. I mean, Facebook is such a huge part of how information is disseminated now. So yeah, I mean, I think these are difficult questions, and it certainly completely transformed our business to sort of answer the question that Walter has. I mean, we've gone from an advertiser-driven company to a subscriber-driven company, and that's an enormous shift to make. It's insulated us somewhat from what other papers are going through right now, because so many papers are still advertiser-driven, and that's it's advertising is just falling off the floor. So, it's really transformed how we do business.
I mean, I think I'm maybe a little bit, I agree with everything that's been said. One thing that gives me hope is that our readers seem to hold us to a higher standard than your average blog or poster or somebody on the internet. Like, we're still somehow seen as, we have to get it right more than the bloggers do. We, if we get it wrong, people get really mad. So somewhere in people's minds, they see newspapers and whatever local media or national media there as we are still in some way arbiters of the truth, even though I kind of dislike that phrase a lot. And that gives me hope. And I think even though it comes in the form of lots of angry comments and letters, it does show that people are still making some level of a distinction between, what somebody on the street says and what we put out there.
I mean, I think if technology were truly corrupting, considering we are only meeting via the web, we would all leave here with less knowledge than we arrived with. So I don't think that's the case necessarily. It is very much a medium, and it is very much what you bring to it. It's interesting, Danny, that you brought that up about Facebook, because that was the moment that I left Facebook, was when I felt like that the people in charge were not interested in presenting genuine information via that medium. And to me, that was a line. And I know that a lot of people, and I lived in the UK at that moment. So it ended up meaning that I had to work doubly hard to keep in touch with the people that I wanted to via, texting or emails or whatever. But at the same time, I do feel like you have to be true to yourself about even if something is a very convenient way of getting something that you want and something that you value, you have to, it's almost like it's on you to distinguish. And in the, having lived in the UK, there are very different privacy laws when it comes to different internet companies, and they're constantly asking you if it's okay to collect your data, which made me realize, of course, when I came back here, that people are collecting my data without asking me. And then that has changed the way that I look at things as well. So I kind of feel like it's more let the buyer beware with the internet, but at the same time, it was an incredibly valuable resource for me in 2008 when I started covering the Jets. Because I was able to interact directly with my readers. So they could read a story that I'd written and then ask me a question. I could go ask a player, I could go ask a coach for the answer, and I could either get that to them, or it might be a story that I wrote, so it ended up being really valuable exchange, and I really liked that. It was kind of the halcyon days of Twitter. Now it's just a lot of people screaming. So I do think there's a lot to be said for that. As for the way that it's changed our business, journalism and advertising were a marriage of convenience. There is no natural affinity between those two things other than the page that things were printed on. And now that is not going to be happening anymore. And again, I'm very angry at the business side when it comes to media technology companies, because even on Danny's beautiful, NRA stories that are appearing in the New York Times, you can get all the way to the bottom of that and then find a link to sponsored content. And sometimes these are things like cut up cucumbers that look a little funny when you first look at them, or, some celebrities that has been technically altered to look strange, or there are things that are designed, they are literal fake news. And they're things that are designed to trick you into clicking on them. And they are at the bottom of legitimate news stories in just about every single media website that you come across. And to me, and this, by the way, this does not pay a lot of money. This is a couple of, fractions of a cent. And we were willing to mortgage our own credibility to have these things placed at the bottom of our stories. And to me, again, this makes me mad, because I feel like it is erosion from within. And that we will chase those fractions of a cent into tricking our readers, rather than finding new pay models to support very, very valuable content.
I'm going to highlight a couple of questions here, and also I'm just going to alert folks we're getting near 4:30. Maybe we'll stay on a little bit after that, but we'll start to forecast wrapping up. Before we wrap up, near the end, I'll go ahead and open up the questions for everyone to see, because we won't get them all answered, and our audience might just enjoy seeing the questions that others asked. A couple that were right out of the shoot had to do with advice for aspiring journalists, and it might be nice. Obviously, Jane, you're right on the front lines of that in your work at Marist, but I'm sure it's something that you all think about quite a bit. And so we got one question: if you could recommend one nonfiction book to every aspiring journalist, what would it be? We have another question on a grassroots level: how would you recommend getting your foot in the door when it comes to journalism in your community? So maybe I'll just let those two out and see what each of you have to say, if you're willing to take it on that way, and maybe just more generally advice for aspiring journalists. Jane, do you want to?
I'll start. Yeah, I'll always start. I don't want to take up all the air in the room.
We'll hear from each of you on this.
So, one book that I really like, and that I think is a really good example of just expertise and reporting, is The Gene by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which has just been made into a Ken Burns documentary that's on PBS. And I find that I like to watch, like science documentaries in my downtime. I know some people would like to watch sports, but I watch a lot of sports for a living. So, that's kind of the opposite for me. And I just think that's a really good example of like storytelling combined with solid reporting, and a way to bring something that's very complex in a way that, and kind of give it to the people. And I kind of feel like that's what journalism should do in a sense. As for getting jobs, so particularly in sports media, like everything's shut down. There are no jobs because there are no sports. Like there aren't sports happening right now. That's not always going to be the case, but it's incredibly challenging for seniors coming out right now who want to get into sports journalism. So my advice is that you get a job that becomes available, whatever that job might be, but that you keep your goal in mind and it's kind of your North Star and you work toward it, as you can. But I also would ask people who are interested in journalism to look around and say, what kind of jobs are becoming available in this completely new pandemic economy that's emerging right now? And I would say, I saw, for example, that the CDC is looking for people to do contact tracing, which is, calling people, talking to them, identifying their contacts and finding out who those people are. And to me, this sounds a lot like reporting. And so I would say, maybe look for jobs that are needed right now, desperately needed, because we are in a new world at the moment. And how can they actually help you develop your skills? And then when we return to something that is a little more recognizable, and we find a model other than advertising that supports journalism, then you are there in line for those jobs and you're available and you've been working on your skills.
Thank you. Danny, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the book question is a hard one. I would say my favorite writing book is Stephen King's book on writing, which I really like a lot. It's not really a journalism book, but it's a great book about how to write. And it's just a good read. In terms of getting jobs, it's such a difficult time right now. I mean, the step I took, I said before, I started as a clerk at the Post, but then I just got a job at a smaller paper. I was looking anywhere in the country really, and I just went to South Carolina and got a job at a smaller paper. And when I was a young journalist, that was really the way, a common way to start in the field. I don't even know if that's like recommended anymore, but that worked for me. I guess the other thing I'd say is, you want to build up your skills as you go. I think for me, learning computer-assisted reporting, learning how to use a spreadsheet, learning, I learned some basic computer languages. That's a big part of certainly investigative journalism, but it just sort of helps any kind of beat reporting you do now. And that's stuff you can teach yourself along the way. So that's been really important in my career.
Yeah, it's an incredibly hard question because the market has always been hard. I've considered myself incredibly lucky. I feel like I have to sort of address two things. One, I went to journalism school. Some of the best journalists I know did not go to journalism school. And that just like say that 10 times over. You don't have to go to journalism school to be a journalist. They're getting your foot in the door. That might be an internship at your local paper. It might be volunteering at a public radio station. I would just encourage you to keep an incredibly open mind on what that first gig might be. My first internship I got at a sort of weird newsletter I'd never heard of called E&E News in Washington, D.C. that turned out to be fantastic. And I was writing about climate change, which I was like sort of interested in, but it wasn't like my passion, but it sort of became that. And I learned an incredible amount in a newsroom that turned out to be pretty well funded and full of a lot of really amazing former newspaper reporters who taught me a lot of the basics of what I need to know. So keep an open mind. You don't have to go to journalism school would be my two big pieces of advice. If you do want to go to journalism school, it does help with connections, but it comes at a big price. And then as far as books to recommend, one of my favorites is Behind the Beautiful Forevers by Catherine Boo. It's a remarkable piece of reporting, beautifully written. I mean, it's just sort of inspiring. And another reason I love it is Catherine Boo was my commencement speaker at Columbia. And I remember watching her walk up to the podium, and she's this incredibly shy seeming, soft-spoken woman. She does not seem like the journalist shoving the microphone in your face that you come to know. And it was kind of my first lesson in realizing there are all kinds of different journalists who work in different ways. And you can be, depending on your personality and who you are, whether it's data journalism or local reporting or radio, like there's a kind of journalist for whatever personality you want to be. And you don't have to be what you think of a journalist to be a really, really good journalist. So that was a lesson I took away from Catherine Boo, but also the book is just stunning and a beautiful piece of reportage and wonderful writing and just a pleasure to read.
So I might suggest, I'd sort of like to give everybody on here one more chance to speak if you'd like, and maybe we'll just go through our seniors first. Either if there's a question you'd like to pose to a panelist, or any comment you'd like to end on, or we did have one prospective student ask a question about something you wish you'd heard about the decision to go to St. John's, so you could shift into your role as counselor to that person. But maybe we'll just hear from Nani, Abdullah, and Mario once more, again, in any of those ways, or if you don't have anything to say, that's fine. And then I'll invite the panelists to offer a last word before wrapping up. So, Nani.
I guess I have questions, but I'll just end it with a comment. I just wanted to applaud and maybe, thank you all for the work that you're doing. I come from a country where, journalists are arrested and prosecuted for the work that they do. You can't really make any posts criticizing the government without them coming after you. And that's been the reality for me growing up and watching the situation in my country. And so it's been amazing coming here and seeing just how powerful journalists are in, not just unveiling a lot of, important issues, but making an impact and even changing, policies and helping with that. And so I just want to say thank you for all the work that you do. And, we need journalism now more than ever. So so keep up the good work.
Thank you. Abdullah?
I wanted to thank you all again, as well as Mr. Sterling for inviting us seniors to come here. I guess I know there are a lot of questions we didn't get to, but there was this short little quote I wanted to read from one of our senior readings in senior year in seminar. We read Tocqueville, the Frenchman who came to the United States and did an analysis of democracy in America. And so he writes that the more I view the independence of the press in its principal effects, the more I convince myself that among the moderns, the independence of the press is the capital and, so to speak, constitutive element of freedom. A people that wants to remain free, therefore, has the right to require that one respect it at all costs. So just wanted to read that quote and reiterate the importance of journalism and the free press for distinctly democratic societies. And if you had any thoughts on that as well.
Do any of you all want to offer a comment on that?
I mean, I'll just throw in here that I agree 100%. I think, it is an imperfect thing that we practice, and we do it to the best of our ability. But I do think that free thought leads to the ability of free people to live in society together. And, part of that is having information and more, I think polarization is due to the fact that we're consuming different information now. And so but it's very important to not let yourself be manipulated. And I think that in that way, journalism sets an example for people, that we, strive to look underneath what people are telling us, that we are, peeking around the corners, we're getting second opinions. And in doing so, it allows citizens to try and think independently and for themselves as well.
Okay, maybe Maria, do you have anything you want to offer?
Yeah, a lot of the questions that we didn't get to ask about objectivity and truth, which are very big questions, I think, for the St. John's community, especially as we just try to engage not just with the books that we read, but then try to apply that thinking outside of St. John's. And I guess for me, one of the things that is great, and maybe you all can talk a little bit about this, is the way in which St. John's might have prepared you for that, to challenge those questions of objectivity or face them head on, especially because, like Elizabeth mentioned, there are people who go into journalism who haven't done journalism school, and if you're all Johnnies who got your bachelor's here, you didn't get it studying journalism elsewhere. And so there does seem to be a link between the way in which St. John's has to prepare you for this kind of work. We did get one question about how you decided to get to St. John's, but I think maybe a stronger question would be just how has that framed your pursuit of journalism in which you go, what you might be doing sort of in continuing that?
I mean, St. John's is about searching for the truth, right? Isn't that what we're always sort of wrestling with in every seminar, almost from different perspectives, different authors? You're trying to figure out the truth of things, and I think it's sort of a natural. It feels like a natural evolution to me to sort of go into journalism to continue that debate. Now, you're always not, obviously journalism is not always so high-minded, or sometimes you're writing about people getting shot, or a governor seeing a prostitute or whatever, and you're not really thinking of high-minded things. But at the root of what we do is search for truth. So I think it just makes for a very natural fit for a Johnny.
Yeah, and you never stop. I mean, I think that's the wonderful thing about St. John's is, you walk out of the classroom, but the conversation's not over. And we write a story, but we know the story's not over. It's just kind of having the courage to keep pressing and keep asking, and every day getting up and going after the part of the story that you haven't gotten to yet. And that does take courage. It does take a sort of fortitude to keep banging your head up against it every day. But I feel like St. John's prepared me for that in a really wonderful way.
Agreed with both of those statements. And I also think there's something about reading the original text. You're not reading a distillation. You're not reading someone's version. You're not reading someone else's conclusions. You're reading it yourself, and you're coming up with something, and then you bring that up in seminar and you start that conversation. And I think there's something to that which leads you to kind of trust your own interpretation of things, and trust the voice in your head that kind of is reasoning through something. And it's something that changes very much from the time you're a freshman until you're a senior, and having to defend your own opinions in a Don Rag. And I think, or your own interpretation, not necessarily opinions, but your own interpretation and view of something. And I think that I think you really do have to trust your instincts and your gut and your ability to reason through something as a journalist as well. And being able to trust. It starts with trusting your ability to do that functionally. And that, for me, started at St. John's and basketball.
Well, I think looking at the clock, I think those are nice closing reflections, unless if any of our panelists want to add a word, I'll say a couple of things as we formally wrap up. Do any of you all have anything you want to get out? I think those were good closing thoughts.
Thank you again for inviting us. Thank you.
Yeah. This has been wonderful.
Well,
I'm just super impressed also with the 3 students who were here, and I cannot wait to see what you all do. And I really can't, Nani, with what you're doing in Ethiopia. And I mean, I'm overwhelmed. I really love seeing the next generation. I wish we could be there in person to meet you all, but hopefully that will happen very soon.
Well, I want to thank all of you, our seniors, for taking the time and the care to participate in this, and you 3 alumni for all your flexibility, your willingness to come visit. I still want to keep you all on the hook for a future visit. Somehow, I don't think these really difficult questions about the fate and career of our democratic society and its relationship to good journalism and the role of a free press, I don't think they're going to go away in the coming days, weeks, months, or years. So I see us together again at some point in the future, pondering how things have gone for an intervening year or two. But I thank you all so much. I thank the audience for attending, and I will mention that we'll be doing a couple more lectures online over the next couple of weeks. Maybe less complex events than this, but we will have a couple of lectures. So I'll stay on for a moment or two in case people want to scan the questions, but we'll go ahead and formally conclude there. Thank you all so much. I couldn't be more grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.